We think it would be best if you stepped back from work for a while. That message came at 6:43 p.m. in the family group chat without warning, without any opening explanation. And the first person to respond was Aunt Vivian. A single like reaction is cold and detached. Not another word. I stared at the glowing screen in my hand, my own face faintly reflected back. Cold, empty. Just one short sentence, one emotionless icon, enough to push me out of their lives. I typed back, understood. I'll respect this decision, and I'll also be withdrawing from the family investment fund. Then I set the phone down on the table, leaned back in my chair. My heart didn't race. It sank. That night, I logged into the fund system. At 9:17 p.m., I officially withdrew my entire stake of $4,200,000, plus my share of the profits from all these years. All of it was done with just a few clicks. No one stopped me. No one knew. Until 2:15 a.m., when my phone started ringing nonstop. Texts, missed calls, voicemails, 89 calls before the sun came up. My father left a message. "Charlotte, what's going on?" "The bank just froze the account. They think there's a serious problem." I simply replied, "I'm just doing exactly what the family wanted." They didn't understand. They had no idea. I wasn't just pulling the money. I was pulling my trust, my loyalty, and the 32 years I'd spent quietly enduring, hoping, longing to be recognized. I'm Charlotte Ellison, daughter of Robert Ellison, and I am the chairman of the prestigious Ellison Financial Group in the Northeast. Since I was a child, I was different. While my cousins were running around the golf course, I sat in the library, poring over market analysis charts. By the age of 10, I had read every quarterly financial report my father's company released. At 11, I spotted a minor discrepancy in interest rate data, something 3 accountants had overlooked. But instead of praise, all I heard was my grandfather's dry chuckle. "A girl buried in numbers all day. Who's ever going to want to marry you? I graduated valedictorian from Wharton, double majoring in finance and economics." And then, my father assigned me to work under Jake, my cousin, who had just retaken his basic investment exam for the 3rd time. My father patted my shoulder on my first day and smiled. "Jake's been here 7 months longer than you. You need to learn how this family operates." How this family operates meant, when I pitched a growth strategy for a VIP client, Jake would present it as his own, and everyone applauded him. When I helped the company hit record profits in a quarter, 62% of revenue coming from the division I led, Uncle Richard still asked in the meeting, "So, what does your father think about these numbers?" My mother, Margaret Kingsley, was sharp and elegant, but once pulled me aside after a dinner party. "Men don't like women talking too much about figures, darling. I believed if I just did well enough, they'd see my worth. I was wrong." And tonight, with just one group message, no one objected, no one asked, no one defended me, only me, alone, sitting in the stillness of my brownstone apartment, staring at each name in the group chat, each name, a tiny cut. Each missed call, a heartbeat gone silent. But what they didn't know, when I pulled out of the fund, it wasn't just about the money. I had struck at the most vulnerable point of the Ellison empire. I was the one holding the very lifeline they didn't even realize. And the next morning, when the bank froze every account in the system, were they ready for what I was about to do next? 7:12 a.m. The next day, I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window of my apartment, looking out over Boston Square as it slowly woke up. The city was alive with movement. People were heading to work as if nothing had happened. Only I could hear my old world collapsing, piece by piece. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. messages, callbacks, even 17 voicemails in just 5 hours. I hadn't listened. Not yet. I wanted to keep this morning peaceful, even if only for 10 minutes. It wasn't until I opened the very first message from my father, Charlotte. What's going on? The bank has frozen the entire fund, the whole system. They need verification from you. I took a sip of coffee. My finger lightly touched the screen. I'm doing exactly what everyone agreed on. And I turned off notifications. They didn't understand. I had been preparing for this for 8 years. Every sleepless night. I work extra hours. I carefully hid every private investment project and profit stream under the name of an LLC. Every client I built a personal relationship with, I kept separate from the Ellison company. No one noticed because no one wanted to look. They were too used to seeing little Charlotte, the daughter, allowed to exist within a man's financial world. But last night, I was no longer someone they allowed. I was the one who chose to pull everything back. When I withdrew more than $4,200,000, the fund lost nearly 35% of its liquidity. What I contributed wasn't just money. It was the growth strategy. The revenue stream no one knew how to operate except me. That withdrawal was like pulling the oxygen line from the entire system, and they hadn't realized it yet. Not yet. There was more to come. 8:41 a.m. In the morning, the phone rang. Then again. And again. The 32nd call was from Uncle Richard. I let it ring. The 33rd Jake. I turned the phone off completely. What I felt now wasn't anger anymore. It was a sharp, stinging pain, like a finger pressing on an old wound you thought it had healed. But it was only scabbed over. They hadn't chosen to sit down and talk. They chose a group text. And in that moment, I realized all my life, I had been trying to become part of the family, but they had never truly seen me as someone who belonged. I pulled up the camera feed in my apartment. Suddenly, I saw myself in the frame. So small. Strangely so. I remembered the times I stood in Ellison's conference room, slide after slide, strategy after strategy. Then, hearing Aunt Vivian say, "Charlotte, your charts give me a headache. Let Jake handle the clients. You're too academic." I laughed. I shrugged it off. I thought, it's fine. I'll just keep trying. Now I see how foolish I had been. A voicemail played. My father's voice. "Sweetheart, I don't understand what's going on. All the accounts are frozen. The Henderson deal won't close without the fund's money. What are you doing?" I stopped listening there. They still thought this was an impulsive act born from hurt. They didn't know. I wasn't hurting anymore. I was acting. And if you're following this story, if you've ever been pushed out of a group you should have belonged to, I want you to remember this: silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. Don't miss the next parts of this journey. Subscribe to Revenge Mark, where every silence has a reason and every counterattack is calculated. But that morning, I still didn't know that the real shockwave hadn't even begun. Would I be strong enough to see it through, or would I break under the weight of my own revenge? I couldn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, but because, for the first time, a vision began to take shape in my mind. If everything I had ever given my talent, my loyalty, my patience was treated as a burden, then maybe it was time to prove they had chosen the wrong person to underestimate. On Saturday morning, I got up early. The apartment was quiet. On the kitchen counter, my phone was still blinking with unread messages. I opened just one from my mother. "Charlotte, I know you're hurt, but this isn't worth blowing out of proportion. This is just a phase of adjustment. They're still our family. I read it twice, then turned off the screen. Not worth it. Those words kept echoing in my head. I opened my laptop. When the account balance appeared, I felt no satisfaction, no relief. I felt only one thing. Every single number, every dollar of profit, every portion I had sweated to create, was treated by them as communal property, used when needed, dismissed when not. At 11 a.m., I received a message from Amanda, my cousin, the daughter of Aunt Vivian. Just one line. "Are you okay?" They're panicking, but no one's talking about how they treated you. My hands froze, and I felt a sharp ache in my chest, because someone, finally, saw. That afternoon, I wandered into a small cafe near the river. No makeup, no laptop, just me, a latte, and my old leather notebook. I wrote the first line. If this is the game they opened, I'll be the one to rewrite the rules. I began outlining what I held in my hands, a list of clients whose contracts had personal clauses tied to me. I registered the copyrights for the financial algorithms in my own name. I established independent investments under the LLC. Customer feedback data is under my control, untouched by anyone else. I turned to a new page. I wrote, "Who will be the first to fall if I pull one more domino that night?" I turned on the TV but didn't really watch. My mind drifted back to an old memory. Last month's meeting, I had been presenting a 12% growth strategy for our VIP client group. Jake walked in 15 minutes late with a coffee cup and phone in hand. When I was only on my second slide, Uncle Richard interrupted Charlotte. "This sounds too complicated. Miller Group grew because we kept things simple and traditional." Aunt Vivian nodded. "Exactly. Clients don't need a mysterious formula. They need to trust the Ellison name." I remember my father just tapping his pen against the table, that familiar signal that he was starting to lose patience. I stayed silent that day. I had stayed silent far too long. And now? I began to wonder what would happen if I stopped staying silent that night. I was no longer just the wounded one. I had stepped out of the shadows, no longer curled up, enduring. I began making plans, not to destroy, but to restore order. I texted Sandra, an old college friend who is now a senior manager at the bank holding Ellison fund accounts. "Do you have time to talk tomorrow night? I need to confirm a few things about account freeze procedures and administrative access rights." She replied immediately, "Of course. Let's meet at 7. Are you okay?" I looked at her message, typed back, "I will be," because from this moment on, I no longer wanted to just be seen. I wanted to be counted, but I also knew, once I set foot on this path, there would be no turning back. The only question was, would I have the strength to see it through 7:00 p.m., 4th floor cafe at the Fairmont Hotel, tucked away in a corner near the glass window? Sandra sat across from me, still with that light touch of makeup, the sharp gaze of the girl who once topped the finance department. She looked at me for a moment, then tilted her head and asked Charlotte, "What exactly are you planning to do?" I gave a faint smile. Didn't answer. Just slid toward her a thin folder printed on paper, watermarked confidential. We talked for nearly an hour. No names were mentioned. No words as direct as take down or retaliate. But the two women sitting there, both understood. She nodded as I stood up. "Looks like you know exactly what you're doing," I replied, softly as a breath. For the first time, from that day on, I lived two lives. By day, I was still Charlotte Ellison, polite, quiet, vanished from the media after the rumor about being removed from client management. By night, I was someone else. Someone is rewriting every single clause in the contracts, reviewing every piece of documentation proving the copyright to the algorithm I developed, making a list of the people in the company who could be affected if I pulled out entirely. I hired my own attorney, someone whose name no one in my family knew. I told him clearly I don't want to sue. I want to protect my intellectual property and, if necessary, use it as a shield. We worked almost non-stop for 10 days. I didn't go back to Ellison Financial's office. I didn't reply to internal emails. I disappeared. But at that very time, I was more present than ever. I began clearing out the office in my apartment, changing the security system, setting up a separate internet network. I replaced every single lock, even the old filing cabinet that my father had given me in my first year at the company. I also called back my trusted collaborators, the ones who had freelanced for me when I was quietly building my own investment firm. We scheduled Zoom meetings, never using any accounts connected to the Ellisons. And then, one midweek afternoon, I stepped into a tailor shop on Newberry Street. The Italian seamstress looked at me and asked, "What style do you want?" I looked at myself in the mirror. Old sweater. Hair was tied up hastily. Dark circles under my eyes from lack of sleep. I said I want a suit. For a CEO. Not an assistant. Not someone's daughter. Me. She was silent for a moment. Then she smiled and began taking my measurements. That night, I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by papers and financial maps, feeling as if I were sitting in the middle of a battlefield. I could clearly see every piece I had put together. The investment funds were already separated. The clients were under personal clauses, and the technologies were assigned independent registration codes. I wasn't just breaking free from their control. I was creating a new structure, one where I was the center. But I would be lying if I said I wasn't afraid. Many nights, I stared at the city lights spilling onto the wall and asked myself, was I going too far? What if the plan failed? What if they sued me for causing serious damage? What if the clients didn't dare follow me because of the Ellison name? But then, I would remember that remark during the quarterly meeting, Charlotte. Let Jake speak. You're making everything more complicated. Or my mother, when I stayed silent after dinner. Don't overthink it. They're doing this because they care about you. I had believed it, and I had been wrong. 1 month after the night I withdrew the money from the fund, I walked into my office now under a new name, Charlotte Capital Partners. The new sign was mounted on the glass door, clean, solid. Just then, my phone lit up. A new email. From the bank. Subject line, Ellison account confirmation of authorized party. I clicked it open. Only one sentence. Additional verification is required to be completed by Charlotte Ellison before 12:00 p.m. Tomorrow? I looked at the clock. 11:48 a.m. 12 minutes to decide. Would I confirm? Or let them realize they had officially lost control? 11:52 a.m. 2 minutes after finishing the bank's email, I still hadn't moved. My eyes stayed fixed on the screen, my heartbeat strangely calm. In 1 more hour, if I didn't respond, the linked account of the Ellison Investment Fund, including all pending transactions, would remain frozen. But this time, frozen because of me, not as a consequence, but as a choice. I opened the verification software, reset the OTP code sent to my phone. My hands didn't shake. A small window popped up, confirm account control continue. I thought about every word they had spoken behind my back, every mocking look, every half-hearted nod when I tried to explain the value I brought to the table. I clicked the button. The first strike had been dealt. That afternoon, I didn't go home. I stopped by my lawyer's office and handed him the contract I had been revising for the past 2 weeks. I'm withdrawing all of my investment from the Ellison fund, but not to stay silent. I want it clearly stated from today on. Any individual or organization using the financial algorithms tied to me must have written permission." He looked up at me, brow slightly furrowed. "Charlotte, you know this will force them to choose either pay royalties or strip out the entire strategy they're currently using from the company you built." I nodded. "Exactly. The choice is no longer mine. It's theirs." That evening, I sat barefoot on the sofa, a glass of red wine beside me. I opened an old file, the VIP client portfolio. Most of them had once called me directly during crises. Some had lost nearly $1 million due to interest rate fluctuations. Some had been denied bank loans due to a reporting error. And I was the one they turned to first. Not Jake. Not Uncle Richard. Me. I sent the first batch of emails, personal meeting invitations to each client who had a specialized service clause signed exclusively with me. Just an invitation. No bad-mouthing. No attacks. But enough for them to start asking questions. 3 days later, I got a call from Ellison Financial's in-house attorney. His voice was tight as a wire. "Charlotte, I need to know what's going on. Some client accounts have requested that their advisory services be moved elsewhere, and the automated investment strategy system just went offline." I smiled softly. "You'll have to ask the tech department. That algorithm hasn't been licensed since yesterday." A brief silence. I could picture the expression on the other end, stunned, panicked, but trying to stay composed. He asked, "Are you sure you want to go this far?" I answered quietly, "This is only the beginning." That night, I stood in my office, the streetlight shining through the window, casting half my face in shadow. I thought about my father, the man who once said Ellison is a name that guarantees trust. And I wondered when he would finally understand trust doesn't come from a name. It comes from how you treat the people who bring you value. If you're listening and you've ever had your work stolen by those hiding behind the word family, remember this. You have the right to reclaim your place, silently, rightfully, and without asking for permission. Don't miss this journey. Subscribe to Revenge Mark to follow the coming battle where justice doesn't come from tears, but from preparation. But I know, in just a few days, Jake will realize he hasn't just lost the strategy. He's losing the company's biggest client. The question is, how will he strike back? I knew that the moment I pressed the confirm control button, a domino chain had begun to fall. But I didn't expect it would fall this fast. Tuesday morning, just as I walked into the office, my assistant Elena was already waiting with an iPad in hand. She spoke briefly, "You should see this." On the screen was a freshly published article on a major financial site. Headline, "Unusual move from a former Ellison family member. Is there an inside hand?" Sabotaging beneath it were a series of insinuations. They didn't mention my name, but everyone knew exactly who they meant. They called me the one who pulled out funds without warning, the individual destabilizing the organization. I tightened my grip on my bag strap. My heart didn't race. It was just cold, ice cold. Their first strike media? That afternoon, I received an email from one of my major clients, Mrs. Henderson. "Charlotte, I just got a call from Ellison Financial. They said you're going through some emotional instability after being temporarily removed from your role and are no longer fit to continue managing assets." 1 second. Just 1 second. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from familiarity. It was the same way they'd tried to silence me before slapping labels on me. Too emotional, too stubborn, doesn't understand how men work. I wrote back to Mrs. Henderson. You were the one who trusted me when the entire company said to keep your portfolio unchanged. I'm the one who helped you get through last year's Q2 up 12% in a volatile market. Those results weren't driven by emotion. They came from analysis, discipline, and knowing my clients. 2 hours later, she replied, I still have that trust. Don't let them drag you into their game. I sat still for a moment, then exhaled. One person stood by me, but the rest? What about them that night? I got a text from Jake. Just 3 words. Enough is enough. I didn't reply, but my hand lingered on the phone longer than usual. Jake hadn't texted me directly since that fateful quarterly meeting, which meant he understood the seriousness of what was unfolding, and he was losing control. The next day, 2 former team members who had worked under me were fired from Ellison Financial. No clear reason given, just cutting personnel who no longer align with our direction. One of them, Mark, messaged me. I guess I caught a stray bullet. I didn't know what to say back, because deep down, I knew that wasn't a stray bullet. It was a warning. For me, I began to see the outline of the classic playbook drag me into the spotlight, smear me, cut my ties to anyone still loyal, isolation, just like they'd done before. But this time, I wasn't the girl sitting quietly in a meeting, swallowing tears as they stole my work. This time, I had lawyers. I had documents. I had digital records of every intellectual property right. I had clients who trusted results, not empty titles. I had no longer doubted, no longer waited for anyone's validation. I looked at my meeting schedule. Tomorrow, I'd be meeting with an international investment group, the kind that could pour into my company the very funding Ellison once called too risky. Jake wouldn't just lose clients. He'd lose his shot at expanding outside the U.S. The thing he once bragged was the dream our fathers never managed to achieve. I locked down the entire internal system, changed my email passwords, disabled location tracking, activated third-layer VPN. I didn't know what tricks they had left, but I knew. From now on, I couldn't afford a single lapse. Not for a minute. Because Jake, I was just getting started. The question was he ready to face the consequences when I had no intention of stopping? The meeting with the international investment group took place at a boutique hotel on the 16th floor, with no nameplates and no media coverage. These were people who didn't care what kind of family name you carried. They only needed to see 2 things, profit and vision. I arrived 10 minutes early. In my hand, just a single USB drive and a printed summary. No flashy slides, no convoluted charts. As I took my seat, I caught the gaze of Michelle Duval, head of Asionis Capital. She had once been rejected by Ellison Financial for having a strategy that didn't fit the family culture. Now, she was nodding as I spoke about my plan to expand the green technology investment product line. When I presented the tiered client strategy, no one interrupted. No one tapped their pen on the table. No one sighed with that bored look my father used to give me. 40 minutes later, Duval leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, looked straight at me. Have you ever thought that if you left the Ellison name, your clients might not follow you? I didn't answer right away. I took a beat. I used to be afraid of that if I didn't carry the Ellison name, I'd be nothing. I lifted my head. But now I know. They don't come for the name. They come for the results, and for the way I listen to them. Duval said nothing more. She simply pulled out a business card. Send me a preliminary contract. If my legal team finds it sound, we'll release the first round $10 million. Within 3 weeks. When I left the meeting room, I didn't smile, and I didn't rush to call anyone. I just stood quietly in the elevator, watching the control panel light up floor by floor as they passed. Inside me, something had softened. Not because of the money, but because, for the first time in so many years, I was fully heard, trusted, not seen as a shadow, an accessory, or someone who still needs more life experience. That afternoon, I received emails from 3 VIP clients confirming they were moving their entire investment portfolios to my firm. No promises, just contracts, something like that. At Ellison Financial would have to pass through 3 layers of leadership. Now, I signed online in under 5 minutes. A system I had once worked for had now become my rival. That evening, Amanda, my cousin, video called me. "What are you doing?" "Charlotte, everyone in the family is on edge right now." I looked at her face on the screen. There was something in her eyes that reminded me of myself a year ago, exhausted, but still trying to hold everything together. "I'm not taking anyone down, Amanda. I'm just rebuilding what should have been mine all along." She gave a small nod. "They won't just let this slide. You know Uncle Richard. You know Jake." I smiled. "I'm not waiting for them to let it slide. I just need them to understand I'm not silent anymore." The moment I ended the call, I felt lighter. I didn't need a flawless victory, just small steps, leading them to the truth that I no longer needed permission. But the very next day, I received an anonymous letter. No sender's name, just a single handwritten line. "What if? Next time. The target isn't your work." I read the letter one more time. The handwriting was messy, and the ink was smudged at the corner of the page. "Next time. Who knows? The target might not be your work." I had thought I was ready for any counterattack, but that line sent a chill straight down my spine. I didn't call the police, not because I was careless, but because I knew someone like Jake would never leave a trace. I replaced every single lock in my apartment, turned on continuous monitoring mode on my security cameras, moved the company's systems server to an independent provider, had all internal emails re-encrypted from scratch. I tried to stay calm, but deep inside, I began to understand what it meant when fear no longer stayed on paper. 3 days later, I walked into the cafe where I was supposed to meet Mrs. Henderson, a VIP client who had just signed a strategic contract with my company. She didn't show up. I waited 15 minutes, then 30, then an hour. Finally, her secretary called back. "I'm sorry, Miss Charlotte. Mrs. Henderson wants to postpone the collaboration. There are a few concerns about your personal stability and public image." I didn't ask further. I understood. That evening, rumors began circulating on financial forums. Charlotte Ellison was once suspended from work for psychological reasons. Her success is nothing more than a byproduct of a big family name. She can't control her emotions, and once lashed out at a client during a closed-door meeting, no one stepped forward to claim responsibility for the posts. But the traces were obvious accounts created the same day. Repetitive phrasing, identical sentence structures, Jake, or someone acting under Jake's orders. I had thought he would retaliate financially, but no. He chose another path. Make others lose faith in me, make me start doubting myself. The next day, Amanda called. Her voice was breaking. "I've just been suspended. Jake dug up an old email I once sent you and used it as evidence of an internal leak." I froze. "I'm sorry. It's not your fault. But now, I could lose everything." I hung up, sat in silence. My throat felt dry. For the first time, I realized I was no longer in control. Everything was slipping away from me. I opened my laptop. Another email had just arrived from a potential client. The meeting request had been canceled. No explanation, just one line. Sorry, we need to reassess the media risk. They didn't have to say more. I knew. Someone was behind it, applying pressure, spreading rumors. Night fell, and I couldn't sleep. I sat in my office, surrounded by piles of paperwork and data I once considered my weapons. Now, they no longer felt like weapons. They were like empty armor, protecting no one. They couldn't protect Amanda. They couldn't keep Henderson. They couldn't stop the rumors. I got up and walked to the door. My hand touched the front doorknob, and it was slightly loose. I was certain I had locked it. I always locked it. I turned my head toward the bedroom. The balcony light was still on. The camera light is still blinking red. Everything looked quiet. But inside me, something had broken. I used to believe this battle was within my control, that as long as I had a solid strategy, airtight legal protection, and loyal clients, I would stand firm. But now, I understood. There are battles that don't exist in any forecast, not in any contract, not protected by any law. They live in the deepest place of human trust. The question was no longer, how do I win? It was, how much longer can I hold on to what I still have? I hadn't left my apartment for 3 days. The door stayed locked. The curtains remained drawn. My phone lay face down. My laptop had been shut down since Friday night. Every time I thought about opening my email, my heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to know anything more. I didn't call Amanda. I didn't text Elena to ask how things were going. I stayed silent. I tried to suppress every movement. If I stayed still long enough, everything might just stop. I used to think I was strong. I had survived being looked down on, being treated as the extra, the lesser version of her father. I had smiled even when someone else cut me off in a meeting. I had swallowed my pride when Jake stole my idea and was praised as a financial genius. I thought I could handle it. But when Amanda was suspended, when Mrs. Henderson turned her back, when rumors began planting themselves exactly where I was most vulnerable, I began doubting myself. Had I really gone too far? I sat on the floor, leaning against the bookshelf. The hardwood was cold as stone. In my hands was an old photo. I was 14 years old, standing next to my father at the opening of Ellison's 10th branch. I still remember that day. I had asked him, "Can I speak for you? I already wrote my speech." My father smiled, placing his hand on my shoulder. "Let me handle it. This isn't a place for a girl." I had just smiled then. But that night, I cried alone in my room. And for years after, I tried to prove to him that I was good enough, worthy of his trust, worthy to stand beside him, not as an accompanying name, but as a partner. Yet here I was now, alone, inside the walls I once called safe. No one called. No one asked if I was okay. The silence was so loud I could hear my own heartbeat. I retraced every step of this journey. I hadn't destroyed anyone. I had only claimed the part I had poured my entire youth into building. But the price? What was it? Sleepless nights. People I cared about were getting pulled into the whirlpool, the fear that even if I won, there would be nothing left worth keeping. I asked myself, if I disappeared, would anyone notice if I walked away, gave everything back? Would they spare Amanda? Would my mother, the one who never called, see that I had tried for the family's honor that night? I stepped onto the balcony for the first time in days. Boston was colder than I expected. The wind was biting. The lake in the distance sparkled with lights. Life carried on, even as I was in free fall. I had no more tears left, only an emptiness I couldn't define. One piercing question: if I collapsed, would anyone stand up for me? And just when I thought I had hit rock bottom, the doorbell rang. Once, then silence. I stepped forward, my hands trembling slightly. On the doormat was an envelope. No name, no seal. I opened it. Inside was a copy of an investment contract, along with a handwritten note: "We still believe in you. See you Monday, 10 a.m. I froze. It was Mrs. Duval's handwriting. Accionis Capital. One door had closed, but it seemed another had just cracked open. I held the contract in my hands the entire morning. My hands still trembled slightly, not out of fear, but because that feeling after everything was still alive in me, the feeling of being trusted. I kept rereading Mrs. Duval's note. The handwriting was firm and concise, with nothing extra and nothing missing. "We still trust you. See you Monday, 10 a.m. No flowery words. No need for explanation. Just one line. Yet it pulled me out of the abyss more than any words of encouragement ever could. I brewed a pot of ginger tea and turned on the jazz music my mother used to listen to every early morning. Sat in silence, not to hide, but to look at myself again. I thought of Amanda, of Elena, of every person who had been hurt because they stood with me, of the 14-year-old who once wanted to speak in her father's place, only to be brushed aside with a smile. I used to only want to prove that I was worthy. Now I understand I no longer need to prove anything. I need to reclaim my place, not for glory, but to protect everything I have sacrificed. I opened my laptop, pulled up every plan I had left unfinished, every line of data, every contract. Every piece of evidence shows how they used my ideas, and erased my name from every report. Not to be angry, but to prepare. Cold, clear. Sunday night, I called Amanda. "I'm sorry I didn't call sooner." She gave a tired laugh. "I figured you needed time. Are you okay now? I'm not sure I'm okay, but I know one thing. I'm not hiding anymore." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What are you planning to do?" I answered plainly, "Make them understand. I'm no longer on the defensive." I sent my confirmation back to Mrs. Duval. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m., I will be there. Not just to sign a contract, but to start over on a foundation free of fear." That night, I looked in the mirror for a long time. I didn't see a survivor. I saw someone who had learned to walk through the darkness on her own 2 feet. If you're following this story, and you've ever had a moment in your life where you were buried under someone else's spotlight, ever been seen as the person behind, as the one who should just stay quiet and work, as the unimportant part, then remember this: you don't need anyone's permission to shine. You only need the courage to stand up one more time. Subscribe to the Revenge Mark channel if this journey speaks to you, because sometimes the only thing you need, it is proof that you are not alone. 10 a.m., the door is waiting, and this time I will be the one to take the first step. 10 a.m., 9th floor conference room at Accionis Capital headquarters. I walked in carrying nothing but the plan that was already mapped out in my head. Mrs. Duval was waiting by the glass window, sunlight casting a sharp angle across her cold, composed face. She turned and smiled. "I like people who don't ask for permission to do the right thing, but you'd better be sure you can take responsibility for it." I lifted my chin and replied, "I'm ready." We signed. Quick, clean, precise. No frills, no champagne toast. A contract worth $10 million. Not just an investment, But the clearest proof yet, I was no longer standing on the sidelines. Leaving Asionis, I didn't go straight back to the office. I went somewhere no one would expect me to return to Ellison Financial's old legal branch. I walked in with a single purpose: to verify every internal clause on intellectual property rights, especially the documents tied to the algorithm system I had developed when I still worked for the family. The attorney in charge froze slightly when he saw me. I got straight to the point. I know what you have in your files. I just need confirmation of who signed the very first exploitation rights. He sat in silence for a moment, then slid a folder toward me. Page 3. Signature line. Charlotte Ellison is the individual founder, not company-owned. I closed the folder, thanked him politely, and left. That afternoon, I powered up my computer and held a meeting with Elena and my 3 most trusted partners. I laid out the entire plan. No concealment, no vagueness. Next week, I'm going public with the Ellison Gap dataset proof that my intellectual property was misused and that profits were falsely attributed to other sources. One person asked, "Is there a risk they'll countersue?" I answered, "Yes, but I've prepared every piece of legal evidence, including internal meeting recordings from 3 years ago, where Jake clearly said Charlotte will never dare claim ownership because she carries the Ellison name." The room went silent. Elena gripped her pen and nodded. That night, I stayed alone in the office, the warm desk light spilling over a wide strategy map spread out before me. On it were client names, legal pathways, media vulnerabilities, and the internal fund structure diagram. I had rebuilt their entire system, not to attack, but to be ready if they pushed any further. No more impulsive moves. I was playing it step by step, like a chess game. And now, I was placing the final piece, an email drafted, ready to send. Subject line: restoring justice. No permission needed. Recipients: the entire Ellison Financial Board of Directors, and the 3 largest media outlets in the financial sector. I didn't send it. Not tonight. But soon. I switched off the light, and I knew. The final battle had begun. I had prepared everything: emails, evidence, an escape route, an attack plan. All the data was encrypted and stored in 3 different locations. An independent legal team was ready to speak up if I got sued in retaliation. Key clients had been discreetly informed, not as a warning, but so they would know I was no longer a part of Ellison Financial. And now, I waited, not to avoid confrontation, but so they would be the ones to make the first move. In the morning, I got a call from an unknown number. No name saved, no greeting, just one familiar word: Charlotte. It was my father. I stayed silent for a few seconds. Then I answered, "I'm listening." He exhaled softly. "You don't have to do this. This is all just a misunderstanding. Whatever Jake or Richard said, they don't speak for the family." I cut him off, but the family let them speak for it. His voice grew heavier. "Don't you think you're taking this too far?" I smiled, not out of joy. I used to think that. But things went too far the moment they sent me that group message. He didn't speak for a few seconds. Then he added one more sentence, no longer in the voice of a father, but in the voice of a chairman. "If you release what you're holding, the consequences won't stop at the company. It will affect our reputation, the funds, your mother, and even people who have nothing to do with this." I heard him clearly. Not a single trace of static. "Then maybe you should be asking who let it get to this point." The call ended without a goodbye. That afternoon, I received an invitation to an internal meeting from Ellison Financial. Time Friday, 9:00 a.m. Location 27th floor conference room, the one reserved for high-level emergency meetings. Topic review of ownership structure and division of intellectual property rights. A long, polite sentence. But I understood. This was a challenge. That evening, I stood in the kitchen washing my teacup. My hands, under the warm water, still felt cold. Amanda called. I put her on speaker. Are you doing okay? Better than usual. Did they send the meeting invite? Yes. She exhaled, then lowered her voice. Watch out for Richard. He's rallying internal voting support. If you lose favor with the board, they'll block your legal intervention rights. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. I know. But this time, I'm not going there to ask for permission. That night, I went into my office and opened the draft of Ellison Gap. I read it from start to finish, not skipping a single word, line by line, sentence by sentence, not to double-check the legal side, but to make sure of one thing: every single word in it was something I was ready to stand behind. Before leaving, I wrote 3 short lines on the whiteboard in my conference room, not for reputation, not for revenge, because I was there and they didn't believe me. Friday, 9:00 a.m., the 27th floor conference room. I would sit in the chair that had once been taken from me, not to ask for it back, but to remind them I never left. 9 a.m. The conference room on the 27th floor was walled with glass on 2 sides. The morning light poured in, cold and unforgiving, like a closed-door courtroom. I was the last one to walk in. Jake was already there, leaning back, legs crossed, tie straightened. The corner of his mouth curled as if he were about to watch a light-hearted play. To his left sat Uncle Richard, head slightly bowed, but his eyes swept the room as if silently counting each hidden vote of support. My father sat at the head of the table. He didn't speak. He didn't look at me. The air was so heavy. Every breath seemed to echo. I took my seat. I brought nothing with me except a thin folder, the printed copy of Ellison Gap I'd prepared the night before. Marcus Langley, the chairman of the board, opened with a blunt question. Charlotte, what proposal do you have for the board this morning? I lifted my head, meeting each person's gaze. I'm not here to make a proposal. I'm here to confirm something. I set the printed report in the middle of the table. This is detailed evidence showing that the investment algorithms the company is currently using were originally developed by me before I was removed from the executive team. Jake let out a laugh, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. You really think a few lines of code are enough to win back a leadership role? I didn't turn toward him. Instead, I slid another folder forward, the legal contract verifying my intellectual property rights. Not a few lines of code. The entire foundation for the SmartWave product line is responsible for more than 42% of the company's profits last quarter, and according to internal documents, deployed under a different name, signed off by Richard to mask its origin. I turned to my uncle. He looked at me, didn't argue, just exhaled softly. I continued, I don't want to sue. I'm not here to tear anyone down. I just want my name restored, and the truth called by its rightful name. Jake's voice sharpened. You're threatening the company, the family, the people who raised you. I locked eyes with him. You didn't raise me, and the family didn't give me an opportunity. I created it myself. The only thing you all did was take it away. Marcus Langley raised his hand. We'll vote now. Motion to reinstate Charlotte Ellison as co-founder of the SmartWave system and to conduct a full internal audit of all activities involving intellectual property. Hands went up, one by one. 7 in favor, 3 against. One of my fathers. I looked at him. I didn't wait for an explanation. Some silences have gone on too long to be broken by words. Jake shot to his feet. "You're destroying the company, all because someone can't accept being second place." I turned to him, my voice low and steady. "No one is born to accept a place stolen by lies." I walked out of the boardroom. No shouting, no tears, no smug victory. Just a sense of relief, like setting down a weight that was never mine to carry. Word came quickly Richard was officially suspended pending an internal investigation. Jake. No one stopped him from leaving. The executive office door closed behind him as if it had never been opened. I returned to my own office, stepped into my conference room, and erased 3 lines from the whiteboard. Then I wrote a new one. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about starting over without fear. I didn't throw a celebration. No champagne, no speeches, no social media posts. I simply returned quietly to my office and looked at the whiteboard where I had written late last night, "Justice isn't about revenge. It's about starting over without fear." My fingers stopped at the words "without fear." Part of me knew I had made it through, but another part, still standing behind me, staring, asked, "What about the things you've lost?" Amanda got her job back. Elena became the chief operating officer of my company. My name was restored as the rightful owner of all the company's intellectual property in every internal record. On paper, I had won, but I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. A kind of tiredness that doesn't sit in your muscles, but behind your forehead, in every breath. Like you've just taken off a suit of armor, only to realize the skin beneath is already covered in scars. I took a walk around the park near my office, not because I needed the exercise, but because I needed stillness. Sitting on a bench, I saw an old man feeding bread to a group of ducklings near the pond, and I suddenly remembered my father, the way he used to do that with me when I was 6 years old. Back then, he was still my father, not yet an Ellison. I don't blame him, not anymore, because I understand now. Power can make people go silent, but the fear of being left behind is what makes them turn their backs on their own blood. That evening, I received a handwritten letter, a rare thing in this day and age. The handwriting was familiar, strong, neat. It was from my father. I sat and listened to you speak today, for the first time in many years. Not in a meeting, but in the way you walked out of that room without bowing your head. Maybe I was wrong for trying to keep an empty chair for someone who never wanted it. But I hope you'll forgive not for me, but for yourself. I set the letter down, not crying, but something in me loosened like a knot quietly coming undone. Jake had left the company, no lawsuits, no statements, just gone. But I knew, for someone like him, silence was the most painful collapse of all. As for Richard, he remained silent during the investigation. No one mentioned his name in meetings anymore. I didn't feel joy, but I felt normal. Justice doesn't come to give everything back. It comes to an end the cycle you once thought you'd never escape. One weekend afternoon, I went back to my old house. My mother opened the door. She didn't ask anything. She just cleared a seat for me, poured me a cup of tea, the kind I'd loved since I was a child. I looked around. The same old paintings. The wooden floor still creaked under every step. "Do you want to stay for dinner? Yes, if you don't mind." She nodded slightly, and for the first time, no one had to keep up any appearances. Just a mother and her daughter. I left as dusk settled in. The yellow streetlights stretched my shadow long across the sidewalk. I didn't walk fast. I didn't need to hurry, because for the first time, no one was chasing me anymore. 6 months after that meeting on the 27th floor, I left the city, not to run away, but to allow myself to start over. For the first time. For me. I rented a small house by the coast in Portland, Maine. In the morning, I woke to the sound of waves. In the afternoon, I listened to the whisper of pine trees behind the porch. A simple life. No meetings, no spreadsheets, no midnight emails. I still ran the company, but I didn't sit in the office anymore. I trusted my team. They had the strength to carry on. I no longer needed to control everything, because in the end, I finally understood power isn't about control. It's about letting go and still standing firm. I learned to paint. At first, I just doodled on the surface of an old wooden table. Then I learned to mix colors, to blend light, to shape each stroke with my own hands, not with a mouse or any AI tool. One day, I painted my father's face back before he became part of the board, and for the first time, I painted myself without feeling strange. A woman, standing at the edge of a rocky cliff, hair tousled, hands bare, no armor, no title, no slogan, just her. One morning, Amanda sent me a photo of the new leadership team. Elena is now officially the CEO. She stood in front of the building with the same determined gaze I once had, and still have, but no longer feel the need to prove. Underneath was a short message. You laid the foundation. We'll build the rest. I laughed, not loudly, but warmly, enough to know I had left behind something that couldn't be erased by votes or slander. That evening, I sat down and rewrote the final line in my journal. I no longer want revenge. I just want to live a life I don't have to apologize for, simply because I stood up. I used to think justice was the goal. Now I understand it's the threshold. After that, you have to write the rest of your life yourself, with no enemy to cling to, no anger left to fuel you, only you, and the choice to live with grace. If you're still listening at this point, maybe you've been through something like I have, betrayed, stripped of your rights, silenced. If so, I want you to remember one thing. You don't need anyone to validate your worth. You just need the courage to say enough and stand up one last time for yourself. Thank you for walking with me through every chapter of this journey. If this story has made you think, stirred your heart, or simply made you see yourself in Charlotte, leave a comment. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And if you want to follow more journeys of resilience, subscribe to Revenge Mark. Because justice doesn't always mean victory, but it always opens the door to something greater, the peace that comes in the end.